As I strolled along the deserted sidewalk in the rain, I zipped up my jacket in a feeble attempt to keep the chill away. I quickened my pace, eager to get home. The day felt much longer than usual. I work at McDonald's. I'm sure anyone who has worked in the food business most likely understands the feeling. It had been a shift of nothing but frustration, and I was grateful that it was finally over. My shoes scuffed against the pavement, echoing as I rounded the desolate corner up ahead. Streetlights illuminated my path as I weaved through the desolate neighborhood. Between the rain and the darkness of the night, it definitely felt eerie to say the least. Suddenly, after walking with my head down, trying not to trip in the darkness, I looked up and saw that a figure appeared from the shadows, coming from the opposite direction. My heart immediately began to thud. It took me a moment to comprehend what I was seeing. He looked like a cop, wearing a navy blue security uniform, with a holstered gun attached to his belt. Despite the reassuring appearance, something about him felt unsettling. Perhaps it was the way his eyes seemed to lock onto me that made me feel uneasy. After seeing me, he stood still and silent, not saying a word. I turned my gaze away, fumbling for my phone in my purse. No one was around, and I felt extremely vulnerable. I had the urge to run, but it felt like my feet were glued to the ground. I slowly began to back away, inching closer and closer to the edge of the sidewalk. Suddenly, my phone lit up, displaying a text message from my friend. I looked back at the figure and immediately saw that he had moved closer. Now standing directly in front of me, his presence seemed to dwarf my own. We held each other's gaze, and I felt like I had stepped into an alternate reality. Time seemed to move in slow motion as I stood there, with my heart still pounding in my chest. He looked ready to make a move and I panicked. That's when it hit me. I remember hearing the mayor make an announcement, warning everyone that there has been an increased amount of human trafficking in the area. Everything else suddenly felt insignificant. My job, my problems, my life, all of it was irrelevant. In that moment, I felt like the only thing that mattered was surviving this horrific encounter. As I started to back away, he began to speak. His words were like daggers, piercing through my skin and rattling my bones. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, not taking his eyes off of me. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to make of it. Was this some kind of trick? His words echoed in my head. My mind was spinning as I desperately tried to make sense of the situation. The shadow of his figure grew larger and my body froze in fear. I felt powerless. I had to try something, anything. As I tried to come up with an escape plan, he reached into his pocket to grab something. Instantly, I stepped back in horror, prepared to run. But then, something unexpected happened. He pulled out a badge and flashed it in front of my face. It was a police officer. He spoke again, telling me that he'd been patrolling the area to investigate the high rate of human trafficking in the area. He had spotted me and thought I might be in danger. I was relieved, though visibly shaken. I thanked him profusely, and he offered to drive me home as he pointed to his parked car up ahead. He added that it was part of his job to ensure that everyone was kept safe. As my heart was still racing from the initial scare, I got into his car and he drove me home. Part of me was still worried, but I had a newfound sense of relief, since he seemed like a pretty nice guy. Everything about him seemed to check out. The inside of the car looked just like a police car, and he was communicating to someone on the radio. As I arrived home, the rain had started to pour, and the police officer assured me he'd patrol the area regularly. I thanked him once more and got out of the car. I had finally made it home safe and sound, or so I thought. As I stood in front of my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so I shrugged it off. I thought about the police officer and how he had saved me from an uncertain fate. And then it hit me. What if he somehow wasn't a real police officer? He had intimidated me into getting into his car, and he had somehow been watching me all along without me knowing. That's when I realized I could be in grave danger. I quickly ran inside, shutting my door behind me. As I peered out the window, it looked like the car was gone, but that wasn't enough to calm my nerves. After some contemplation, I decided to call the non-emergency police line and ask them to confirm that an officer drove me home. Hearing their response literally made me drop to the floor. None of the officers gave me a ride home. Now realizing I'd been driven home by a stranger claiming to be a cop, I filed a police report. I'm still left with so many unanswered questions. He easily could have taken me when I got into his car. The events of that night still deeply disturb me, even though it happened 3 months ago. The police have no leads, and that person is still out there. I just pray that he doesn't come back. A few years ago, when my daughter was 9, we both experienced the most terrifying night of our lives. To give some context, my husband and I had just gotten divorced, and I was struggling to get by with being a single mother. Despite the awful circumstances at the time, I was managing it the best I could. I found night walks to be a great way to clear my clouded mind, and it helped me think in a more positive manner. On this particular night, the stress of life was really getting to me, and I desperately needed a way to escape. Without giving it much thought, I stormed out of the house and began walking. There was a local park not too far away from my house, so I thought I'd walk around there for a little bit until I felt better. My daughter had school the next day, so she was already in bed. My walks usually lasted no more than a half hour, so I'd often leave without telling her. We live in a small neighborhood that borders the park, so I liked walking around there for the most part. The temperature was dropping that night, so all the rain was turning into ice, which made it very slippery. I couldn't have been gone for more than 10 minutes when I got a notification on my phone from the Ring doorbell app that there was motion detected at the front door. That alone was enough to freak me out, but I tried to think of why somebody would be standing there on our front porch this late at night. It was too late for solicitors, and I wasn't expecting anybody, so I opened the app on my phone to see who it was. The images on my phone still give me chills to this day. There was a man. He was wearing a white t-shirt and shorts. I watched as he paced back and forth, almost as if he was scared. He kept looking behind him towards the street, then back at the camera. Knowing my daughter was inside, sound asleep, I knew I had to talk to him to see what was going on. Trying my best to not sound creeped out, I said, "Hi, can I help you?" I don't think he was expecting to hear my voice, let alone any voice at all. He snapped his head around and put his face right up against the camera. He whispered, "Please help me. They're coming." Hearing that made me completely freeze, and I truly had no idea what to say. So many questions raced through my mind. Why did the guy need help, and why was he at my house? I was at a loss for words, and didn't reply to the man at all. I started running home, all while watching the feed from the camera. The man continued to pace back and forth, seemingly becoming more and more restless. Then, once I was a few minutes away from home, the man started screaming at the camera to be let in. Again, I gave no response, hoping he'd give up and leave. That's when I started thinking that he was on drugs, because he leaned into the camera again and kept whispering, "They're coming." It became more and more apparent that he was delusional, and it didn't look like he was going to be leaving anytime soon. I now know that I should have done this sooner, but I called the police. I continued watching the feed as I spoke with dispatch, filling them in on my strange situation. They told me they'd have officers there within 5 minutes, and to not approach my house. As badly as I wanted to sneak inside from my backyard, I knew that I could not only be risking my life, but my daughter's life as well. If the man saw me trying to get in and attacked me, he'd have the key to my house where my daughter would be left completely vulnerable. Then, out of the left corner of the screen on the camera feed, I watched a black SUV slowly pull up to my house and stop out front. The man at the door took notice of this and let out the most terrified shriek I've ever heard in my entire life. He turned to the door one last time and pounded on it as hard as possible, then took off running down the street. The car followed him, but after that, I obviously couldn't see anything else. By the time I got back to my house, the police were pulling into my driveway. After talking with them, I sent the footage from the doorbell camera, and they told me to call them back if anything else happened. Well, that was 3 years ago today, and I've still learned nothing. The man very well may have been on drugs, but he was definitely being chased by someone. Not knowing what happened that night kills me. I can't help but wonder why the guy was being chased, and if he's even alive today. I'm not sure what would have happened if I had been home at the time and I answered the door. After talking with several people and reading similar stories online, it sounds like it could have been a trap. However, there's also a chance that his life really was in danger, and the person, or persons, inside the car really could have had sinister intentions. I don't like to think about it though because I can't help but to feel guilty. I'm just happy that my daughter and I were safe. I've still never told her about it to this day. I'm not sure if I'll ever find out what truly happened, but I can't help but think about it every day. Exercise has always been something I've kept in my life. That was until I became a mother of 3 kids. My life became hectic, to say the least. My regular work, on top of the full-time job of being a mother, took its course in many aspects of my life. I found myself at a point where I had little to no free time to do anything whatsoever. 2 months ago today marked 1 full year since I gave birth to my last child. That day was also when I decided that I would slowly work my way back into regularly exercising. I set a goal for myself to walk every day for the next year, even if it was just a small walk. At the time, I didn't realize how hard it really would be. My schedule was still crammed, so the only free time I'd ever get was late at night, once I put everyone to bed. Instead of watching TV for an hour or so before passing out, I decided to supplement that time with night walks. The first couple weeks were tough, but after that, I fell in love with my new and much healthier routine. I was losing weight and sleeping much better. Everything was going great until I stepped outside of my house last week for my usual walk. It was Thursday night, and I had just put the kids to bed. After lacing up my shoes and bundling up in my hat, jacket, and gloves, I made my way down the driveway for my walk. I knew my neighborhood like the back of my hand, especially after taking the same route every day for the past 2 months. As I made my way down the sidewalk, I was walking with a much quicker pace than usual. The temperature was in the single digits, and the strong gusts of wind made it feel 10 times colder. But I wasn't going to let that stop me from going out. I was dedicated. The occasional Christmas lights that were still left up on the houses helped distract me from the cold. I kept walking along the sidewalk until it dead-ended into a ditch that stretched ahead for the next quarter mile. That marked the point where I'd have to cross the street and walk on the other side, which bordered the highway. There were maybe 30 yards of woods that stood between the road and the metal fence by the highway. There was a small strip of grass before the woods, which made for a nice path, but also freaked me out sometimes. I'd always worry that something would pop out at me, but I knew that would never happen. As I continued making my way along the grass, I spotted an animal staring at me ahead. I initially thought it was a raccoon or a groundhog, but as I got closer, I realized it was a dog. He was shaking, but let me approach him as I calmly spoke to him. Once I was within a few feet, I realized that I'd seen him before. He belonged to a house up the road. I'd often see him outside in the mornings when I'd drive by for work. He wasn't wearing a collar, so I assumed he slipped out of his chain when the owner let him outside. I was happy that I found him. I doubt he would have survived for very long in this weather too. Once he became more comfortable with me, he let me pick him up, and I started carrying him home. As soon as I turned up the driveway, I noticed that all the lights were on in the living room. I rang the doorbell, but there was no answer. I ended up trying several more times, but for some reason, nobody was coming to the door. I had never met the owners of the house, but I knew that they were home since the 2 familiar cars were in the driveway. It definitely seemed odd, and I was surprised that they weren't looking for their dog. There wasn't much I could do, so I decided to call the police and ask them to do a welfare check on the house. Shortly after making the call, the police arrived. By then, the dog and I were completely frozen, so the officer let us sit inside of his cruiser. I watched as they knocked on the front door, but again, there was still no answer. I started getting worried, wondering if something bad happened to whoever lived inside the house. The officer came back to the car and told me that I needed to go home, since they were going to have to go inside the house. Before responding, he offered to drive me home, mentioning that I looked like I was getting frostbite on my nose. I happily accepted his kind offer and asked if I could hang on to the dog, since I didn't want him to go to the pound. Now, most cops would have probably said no, but he jokingly said, "What dog?" and began driving me home. He dropped us off, and I went inside with the dog to warm him up and feed him. Even at that point, I wasn't even tired at all, given the strange circumstances of the night. While I was watching TV, I almost flew out of my seat when I heard a gunshot. I instantly thought of the police at that house. A million thoughts raced through my mind, and at that point, I had to go see. I put the dog in my car and slowly drove up the street, trying not to make it obvious that I was watching everything unfold. Once I was within maybe 50 feet of the house, my heart sank. 2 people were being wheeled out of the house on a stretcher. A white blanket was laid over each person as they loaded them up on the back of the ambulance. I watched in disbelief as an EMT wheeled out a 3rd body. Seeing that was enough for me, so I turned back around and headed straight home. I really have no idea what happened in that house that night. All I know is that I was just feet away from the house where 3 bodies would soon be pulled out. I've since contacted the police asking what happened, but because it's still an ongoing investigation, they told me they'd eventually contact me. Something absolutely horrific happened that night, and as of now, I know nothing.